we can get started.
Okay, first I'm gonna welcome our discussants to this mini panel or roundtable, if you will. We are currently all members of the Black Sexuality Studies Collective, and we are tasked with thinking through a question that is actually central to the collective's project, which is what happens to our understanding of anti-Blackness if we put sexualities at the center. We have 3 faculty and 1 graduate student with us today. I'm Terrance Wooten. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Black Studies. We have Dr. Ingrid Banks, who is a professor in the Department of Black Studies as well as the chair of the department. Matthew Richardson, who is a professor in feminist studies, and Mariah Weber, who is a graduate student in feminist studies and ABD.
On the way.
almost ABD, and that's what matters. Okay?
Let's not say almost. We're working on it.
So we are just going to be in dialogue. We're each going to share our reflections, our responses to the question, and then we'll have a dialogue afterwards. And the intent of this conversation is to really generate more dialogue, questions, opportunities to invite the listeners into these conversations from our perspectives of our different genealogical perspectives, our different fields approaches, but also our different expertise and how and where we enter these questions. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mariah.
All right, so I guess I'll begin with thinking about our primary question, which is what happens to our understanding of anti-Blackness when we put sexualities in the center. I think a lot of times when we enter like the study of Black studies, there's not a lot of emphasis on like sexualities or erotic lifestyles or things that hint at pleasure, sexual identity or gendered identity. And so I feel like when we begin to put sexualities at the center of our understanding of anti-Blackness, we have like a more, I guess, well-rounded understanding of what Blackness really is, a fullness, like, if you will. And so like not considering Black studies to only be about, I guess, white supremacist informed assumptions of what Blackness is supposed to legibly or respectably look like. And so we get that fullness of like a full human self, of like a fully realized, fully erotic, like living a very authentic lifestyle for Black people when we put sexualities at the center. I think that's something that I value in my own research. Personally, I look at Black Southern erotics, so I'm interested in like a spatial mapping of like erotic expression within the Black South and the ways that Black people in the South have utilized the erotic not only as a way to live a more fully realized life, but as a methodology to have a more spiritual or connection to like an energy that sustains like a kind of life force within us and keeps us going in the face of all of the death and, you know, things that we experience. So when I put sexualities at the center of my research, I'm really hoping to just capture a part of the Black experience that is about like feeling an embodied, a fully embodied version of myself and like expressing that to my community. So if anyone has anything they'd like to say after that, please follow up.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much for that, Mariah. I agree. When we put sexualities at the center of our understanding of anti-Blackness, but even our understanding of Black studies, of Black communities, right, of Black identity, then we do have a fuller, a more inclusive understanding of Blackness, but also what constitutes Black community, and also what constitutes Black pain in terms of who actually is is seen as a victim within Black communities. And you know, what I really like about this question is that, at least for me, it's about anti-Blackness, but understanding it from this internal framework. Now, the work that I'm doing is coming from an external standpoint, but I mean, I do want to say something about the importance of centering sexualities within the context of anti-Blackness in terms of what happens within Black communities. Because, you know, and I think about this when I teach gender and sexuality, when I teach my Introduction to African American Studies course, you know, I think about Sakia Gunn being murdered at the hands of a Black man in 2005. And I think about Trayvon Martin being murdered in 2013 at the hands of Zimmerman, who's a white man. And what if we had placed sexuality and gun sexuality at the center of what happened to her? We would have had a different, you know, we would know who Sakia Gunn is just as much as we know who Trayvon Martin is. And so this whole understanding of Black liberation, you know, and you know, who can be the victim of anti-Blackness, right? Of anti-Black violence. Right? And so I'm constantly, you know, talking to my students about this, and I often invoke Gunn and Martin because we're talking about two Black kids. You know, Gunn was 15 when she was slain. Martin was 17 when he was slain, and yet the whole reaction, right, is different. And so, you know, that's you know part of, you know, thinking about who is actually victimized within these narratives of anti-Blackness within the context of Black communities. Now, the work that I am doing that looks at basically these intimate relationships between, excuse me, Blacks and whites during segregation, but I'm looking at it from a business standpoint and looking at the experiences of Black male and female hairdressers, and particularly thinking about Black male hairdressers or barbers, because you actually had gosh, my memory, Quincy Mills terms color line barbers, Black men who could only serve white men. And one of the things that I'm theorizing, if we understand segregation and this whole white supremacist, supremacist narrative of separation, right? This is what Plessy ruled. But and we know this, within the context of intimate relationships during slavery, you know, proximity didn't matter. But even within the context of proximity, within the context of Black barbers and their white patrons, proximity didn't matter. Proximity mattered within the context of these political things, or, you know, within the social realm, you know, riding trolley cars, buses. But I'm theorizing this notion of democratic intimacy. And one of the things I argue is that white supremacists did not embrace this notion of democratic intimacy within the context of the social, cultural realm, but it was okay within the context of business as long as Black folk were serving whites. Now, that's nothing new, but there is something that, you know, I think that is unique within the context of the hairdressing profession, because, for example, you were talking about live bodies. This wasn't the case with undertakers, even though black undertakers weren't allowed to serve white bodies in death. So, I'm trying to think about just not sexualities in my work, but how sexuality itself is constructed, and how Black sexuality has been constructed over time. And I don't know how you disengage it from anti-Blackness. I don't. It's always been there. Going back to Africa, during the transatlantic slave trade. So, I'm grappling with that in my work that looks at these intimate spaces and proximity in spite of legalized segregation under Plessy. So I'll stop there.
Thank you both. I've been thinking about some of these questions for a while, and in my first book, I was thinking a lot about the question that you just raised, Ingrid, in terms of what happens when Black queer people are killed or brutalized by state actors in some way, and how those stories are not necessarily centralized, how they get lost. And I think that if we kind of centralize the embodied experience of Blackness in terms of sexuality, in terms of gender, identity and expression, I think that we get a very different understanding of violence against Black people too, right? Like, not only do we get another kind of expanded understanding of bodies and intimacies and relationships, but we also get a different way that people understand what is when things, when the state acts in a violent way, we would perhaps take it seriously as specifically attacks against our communities. And for an example of this, I'm thinking about the anti-trans laws that are being passed and enacted around the country, and these laws would are specifically targeted at youth, right? Often targeted at young trans girls to keep them off of sports, but also to ban parents from being able to access treatment and kind of medical care for their trans kids. Now, see, that's something that should be seen as an attack on very vulnerable members of Black communities, right? And in terms of both kind of sexuality and gender, something like the North Carolina bill is particularly like an egregious example of this. And so the North Carolina bill, what it does is requires government employees, so that means like teachers and I don't know who else falls under government employees, to notify parents if any minors are witnessed, kind of quote, exhibiting symptoms of gender dysphoria or gender nonconformity. That is an overreaching and devastating piece of legislation that has the potential to truly impact the lives of a lot of young Black people of varying genders and sexualities, right? And so I think that cuts straight through to both lesbian and gay communities, and also trans communities, bi communities, right? Like it cuts straight through to so many in all kinds of people of varying genders and sexual identities before people can even get out the gate, right? Like that just it's about policing sexuality, right? Like it's an anti-trans bill, but it's also about policing sexuality of Black people and everybody, and it's about particularly a misogynist attempt to rid femininity, probably from people who are assigned male at birth, right? Is part of the primary anxiety here. Although also will be about kind of attacking anybody who displays any kind of non-patriarchal gender as imagined by the state. So I think that is the kind of thing, right? Like if we were thinking about Black queer and trans people as central to a community, that's the kind of thing that should make all Black North Carolinians stop in their tracks and be like, this is unacceptable, right? This is an attack on us. And I think that those are the kinds of moments where we really need to truly, I mean, there are all kinds of moments, but something like that is where we really truly need to question how much we are, as broadly as Black people are wedded to particular kinds of, homophobia or transphobia or patriarchal notions of gender and sexuality, because this is a brutal and cruel attack on Black people, as well as everybody else in the state. And there are several of these bills. I'm not, North Carolina has this, is one of the ones that has this, particular kind of sinister edge to it with the turning children in somehow, but this is going on in varying ways across the country.
Yeah, so it's like really connected, but it's gonna seem like a pivot. I'm just going to work you through this, okay? So as you all are well aware, we've been in a COVID-19 pandemic for over a year. And recently, in the last like 3 weeks, I have been catching up on season 3 started, allowed myself to start season 3 of Pose. Which I have many thoughts and many things about the show, etc. And this being the final season, and whether or not I feel like the writing is really where it used to be. These are all the kinds of thoughts I have. But one of the things that I found that I've been grappling with, or that I had been thinking through, that is actually rooted in this question without me realizing it, is that like I'm not actually particularly moved as much by Pose as when it first came out. Like I have seen a remarkable shift or felt a shift and the direction and content and the writing. And some of it seems a little bit more hokey and more geared towards a white audience. But I had a deep desire to watch it and to keep watching it. And I realized in the process that, it's because at its core, it's a show about Black, queer, and trans folks making and creating home space in what seems like the impossible, happening at its own kind of pandemic for Black, queer, and trans folks, which is the AIDS epidemic, which, by the way, is still functioning as a pandemic for Black folks globally, right? So I don't want to pretend like we're past that as a kind of anti-Black pandemic. But so it's set in the height of the AIDS epidemic, which shifts so many sets of things and relations. It creates these boundaries, as Kathy Cohen says, around Blackness, who gets to be Black, how we embrace or don't embrace Black folks, and particularly Black, queer, and trans folks. And it, as a result, to Mariah's point, is that Reese and Ingrid's point, it respatializes desire, right? Like touching and intimacy and coughing on someone and fluids were all sort of marked as threatening. Black, queer bodies, trans bodies were marked as threatening bodies by their very existence, that there was a notion that we could not just threatening, but we were infectious bodies. And so we needed to be managed, and our spaces needed to be managed, and our homes needed to be managed, and belonging to whether or not we could count as or belong to Black communities needed to be managed. And what I find parallel, although I'm not always convinced with some of the similes that people have made with COVID-19 and HIV/AIDS, as if HIV/AIDS is over, but is that there's been this regulation around touch and desire and intimacy, but it's also been about how, as the show goes, like in the context of all this, Black people coming together and grinding and dancing and moving and sweating with each other and holding each other. And so and this has been the pandemic as it is, the COVID-19 is its own anti-Black pandemic, right? And how Black folks get to, and if we get to, and the illegality or not of our touching and holding and the intentionality of our construction of pods, that's all about intimacy and desire and pleasure and state-sanctioned regulation and biopolitics. And those themes ring true for Pose. And so one of my favorite episodes is from season 1. It's the first episode that Jenna Mock co-directed and wrote. And it's the episode Love is the Message. And there's a scene in which Blanca, MJ Rodriguez, and Pray Tell, Billy Porter, are in an AIDS ward, and they are singing a duet, and the duet is Home from The Wiz. And so it's, when I think of home, I think of a place where love is overflowing. And so here in this space where they're not supposed to be, and both of them are actually HIV seropositive, where they're not supposed to be alive, where they're not supposed to be intimate, where they're not supposed to be singing in syncopation, right? Where their voices are literally flowing between each other. You have a gay Black man and a Black trans woman who's also Puerto Rican, so Afro-Puerto Rican, right? She has an African-American parent and an Afro-Puerto Rican parent, singing in an AIDS word where Black folks where actually a lot of Black folks don't even make it before they die. And they're singing about home and the possibility of home and making home. And so in my work, I've been thinking a lot and writing a lot and thinking through and writing through how we understand the creation and management of home as one that is happening through the regulation of sexuality, simultaneous to where Black sexuality is also always around Blackness. And so this song, Home from The Wiz, which The Wiz is its own queer production in so many ways. And you could argue, and one should argue, that it is about sexuality. But I think the general sort of the response at the time wasn't reading it necessarily and through the lens of sexuality, but certainly reading it through the long array of Black folks trying to claim and think through and imagine and create this place called home. And to have a Black queer and Black trans, two Black queer trans subjects singing about home in the context of what is in effect a graveyard, to me speaks volumes to the necessity for understanding anti-Blackness through the hermeneutics of sexuality, thinking about how touch and desire, intimacy, pain and pleasure, because at the other part is like sexuality is really about messiness, right? There's like a way, it's not about the resolution of things. Like you have, like sex itself is both, can be pleasurable and uncomfortable and painful and messy, and then also a desire to make it as sterile as possible, right? And complicated. And I think that, sexuality allows us, or insists rather, that we point to the messiness and the complications opposed to sterilizing. And I think that our conversations around anti-Blackness have been particularly sterilized. And I hope that an invitation of reading anti-Blackness through sexuality it creates an aperture for us to really point to the messiness, and the messiness that is not just about state sanction, right? To go to reiterate Matt and Ingrid's point, right? Like there's also this intra-community messiness that has so much to do with the state, but also is happening coterminous to and sometimes independent of the state. And how do we deal with that? And I think sexuality and desire and intimacy allow us to, or it pressures us to do so in a way that simply narrating state-sanctioned violence, while also, I think, then I'll stop talking, really thinking state-sanctioned violence through these questions, because it's also a question about who does the state get to touch and how does the state get to touch us, right? What does it mean that an officer kneeled on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds in a pandemic where we're not supposed to be touching? And that kind of touch was actually sanctioned and warranted and advised, and people had to stand by and watch, right? And so there are also certain kinds of touching that gets to happen that is rationalized in the name of the state. So we also have to read state violence through the lens of sexuality as well.
Wow, that has been fabulous. Ingrid, please.
I just want to say, Terrance, Pose is now available on Hulu, so stop talking about it because I haven't watched any of it. I don't need no spoiler alerts from you. Chill. I did not interrupt you, but I was like, there he goes. So I wanted to start off by saying this, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mariah. The second thing, you're making me think about, what the pandemic has, the pandemic ushered in so much, but perhaps within the context of respectability politics, perhaps we can now move into a post-respectability politics within Black communities, right? Such that we actually deal with the messiness of sex and sexuality, as you say, Terrance, because we can't go back. We can, but again, the messiness has always been there. It's just that it's been trumped by these ideas about race. And so then race becomes, this foreboding, trope for, Blackness and therefore anti-Blackness, such that Black queer folk aren't even read as Black, right? But that's part of this anti-Black rhetoric narrative, even when these heteronormative understandings about Blackness are put forth. But you just cannot extract sexuality, sex from any discussion about Blackness, right? Right.
What I want to ask, like, what would it take, right, to get Black people to a post-respectability point, right? Like, I don't know if this is the moment. I wish it were. Yeah. I don't know what because there has been so much of a burden on Black people to have to present oneself in the most kind of patriarchal terms possible. Otherwise, you are, Moynihan said it was a tangle of pathology. There's just not enough patriarchy. His whole point was that the patriarchy wasn't embedded enough in Black communities, right? And it just made people, it made the genders all messed up, and the women took over. I mean, his thinking was just absolutely poisonous, that perspective. But so and his wasn't the first one to kind of come up with this idea. So I'm wondering, like, what would it take to get Black people to another place, to release some of that, to see it for what it is, right? To see it for the anti-Blackness that it is. Like, what is, what would it get to take Black people to think about certain kinds of heterosexism and homophobia and transphobia and patriarchy as anti-Black constructions in and of themselves. And I'm very interested in that, and I know that we can't solve this right now, but it's certainly a question that that I hope that Black people can continue to take up.
For sure. As you were speaking earlier, I was thinking about all of our conversations over the quarter. I took Matt's Black Film and Protest class. We were talking a lot about necropolitics and the ways in which like the state surveils very intimately or surveilled very intimately a lot of folks who were involved in like different types of movement work. So thinking about MLK, thinking about Billie Holiday and their art. Thinking about the ways that the state would literally mess with their partners, mess with their families, plant drugs into their lives, tap their phones, expose like very intimate conversations with their lovers and things like that. And so I was also moved, Terrance, when you spoke about this concept of home, of like a space where Black people can have a home and sexualities while considering like the necro-political lifestyle, literally like being Black, of knowing that you're always going to be surveilled and that your body is seen and read as dangerous. And that the state has a decision in whether you live or die. I don't know if you guys have listened to Solange's last project, When I Get Home. Did anybody hear that? Solange's last project, When I Get Home. Well, she has like a series of visuals situated in Texas, where she really has like this artistic expression of like Black, I'm sorry, I was cutting out. I said, had you guys seen When I Get Home? When I Get Home by Solange, or heard the visual album or seen it? Well, she released an album, I think in 2018. And it's basically like a series of visuals. It's another visual album where she uses like these Afrofuturistic aesthetics to kind of imagine like, it's like a escape from, and also an interrogation of anti-Blackness. And so I was reading that and also there's a lot of erotic imagery in it, right? Like she's got like some nude scenes where she's like in gloves and her hair is like all the way down. And then there's girls in bikinis. Like there's a lot of erotic imagery going on. And so I was thinking about it as a concept of home, HEAUXM. So like home, right? So like combining this erotic imagery as like a space where we can go to kind of have some type of reprieve, right? And then the more you got to talk about those bills, Dr. Richardson, I was thinking about Stallings' work. And in answering your question, Ingrid, LaMonda Horton Stallings talks about in her last book, A Dirty South Manifesto, like ways that we can create like underground methodologies for like learning. And I really think that people just don't understand like historical and the way that history plays into our thinking, right? And our conditioning and the way that we approach and care for one another. They think that these ideologies like transphobia, homophobia, like this is just like innate. They don't understand like we do. They don't have, like our communities, I feel like when I'm thinking about like just regular Twitter conversations, don't have the breadth of like knowledge that we have about all of these things. And I don't want to make it seem as though like folks aren't thinking, because the thinking is definitely being done. But I feel like there are underground or not formalized methodologies that people are working to do that. I see that a lot in TikTok, like Black TikTokers now are like really like getting information out and like doing little dances and like talking just about ways that we enable homophobia. And I really do, well, not only homophobia, but a lot of different anti-Black ideologies around sexuality, how we raise our children, just a lot of different things. So I was thinking about all of your conversations, but I did want to just leave off with just thinking about like maybe how this space serves for like a form of underground methodology or this conversation for, you know, getting dirty with sexuality. That's what Stalling says, like getting dirty and like not being afraid to get in the dirt and go underground of all, because we have all of these systems above ground that are very harmful. And so Black people have always had to organize in these, you know, spaces that are closed off or in the woods, in the dirt. I'm thinking about ring shouts and beloved, you know, like outside, we're outside with it. So what could that look like? We're at about 42 minutes. So maybe we can wrap up at the 45 and I'll just let folks make some closing remarks. Does that sound good? Okay.
Yeah, I just will say I love that this turned to what I want. I just love LaMonda's work. So let me just say that, okay? Let's keep it a stack. But also this reminder, right? So on one hand, I immediately too thought, Mariah, like this is more opportunities like this seem important. Partially because I do think, especially as academicians, so much of our work is only legible, or we are pressured to make it only legible through text, through books, through that are like guarded by paywalls, which that's part of the name of the game, but it's also part of our work to reframe the game, right? Like to actually dismantle that and understand that that too is part of the persistent anti-Blackness. And so I think that us taking stock of that and creating new spaces and opportunities and new ways for folks to engage, that also at the same time, to your point, Mariah, doesn't presuppose that quote unquote community doesn't know how to read, or the community, because that's also been a long underground practice of Black folks, right? It's like actually learning all kinds of tools that weren't made for us, right? And so I think that having multiple different languages and on multiple different registers is really important to help us get to that point that Ingrid invited us to imagine, and Matt put a little bit of urgency on and said, like, what does that post respectability politics world look like? And I think that I too am curious, but I do know that it's something that we create. And as Black people, we have always, and particularly Black queer folks, and gender nonconforming and trans folks have always had, like, that's why I love Pose and balls in general, Ingrid, because I don't want to ruin anything, because it's also about the work of creating things out of nothing. You take the scraps and you create an entire gown, right? And so it's like, and we have that methodology also in us.
And I love that. I mean, I love what you stated, how you put, what is it going to look like to, Matt, and I think, I mean, the pandemic exposed so much about racial inequality, socioeconomic inequality, and we were denied so much, right? And COVID certainly hit Black and Brown communities disproportionately, but but COVID didn't necessarily discriminate in terms of, even though folks who were, even density didn't matter, because I was reading something in the New York Times, and you had folks, in like a New York City apartment, and they were saying how, look, COVID didn't hit here, but then there was this, neighborhood in, suburbia, and, folks were going down. But, I think that even though, AIDS continues to be a crisis that hits, different segments of Black communities, even though it's seen as a quote unquote gay disease and gay male disease. Perhaps because COVID actually hit folks, regardless of race, class, gender, sexuality, and maybe coming out of this, folks will say, you know what, I didn't get to, touch. I didn't get to do these things. And so maybe, recognizing, the messiness that comes with, with sex, with understanding how sexualities actually are central to Blackness, but also, thinking that, hey, there are queer Black folk who caught COVID and catch hell just like any Black folk, just like any Black person. And so I don't know if people are going to be, more woke, as the young people say, or folks are going to be empathetic. I don't know. But I'm hoping that it can help us think differently about how we think about anti-Blackness, and thinking about it, as Matt said, just not only within this context of, we have a fuller sense of Blackness when we, Mariah said this. It's not, but it's not just about a fuller sense of Blackness, but how we understand violence against Black folk, and that's key, because in many ways that's, ground zero when we look at all of these anti-trans laws, right? So, I don't know. I guess because, being vaccinated and seeing folks who are vaccinated and people, everybody's hugging and everybody's on top of each other, and I don't even care. I'm like, yes, hug me, touch me, and Terrance knows I'm the biggest germaphobe, but I'm like, if I could, be turned around, if I could be turned out, it's like, hey, anybody can, because I'm just like, folks with runny noses, and I'm like, yes, give me a hug, so maybe there is hope. Maybe there is.
This is a great conversation. I don't know what it's going to look like, but I'm looking forward to it, right? I'm looking forward to also us thinking about and embracing what's messy. I think that Black people have been trained by anti-Black violence to want to clear away all messiness, all fluids, anything that is not standard. And what happens when things do get messy and the boundaries are unclear, and we're thinking about a kind of complexity of Black embodiment and life and experience in ways that have previously been seen to be overwhelming and too much, and we can't do that because we got to think about these other things. And so I am interested in what happens next, whenever that next is. And I'll see y'all there. We'll keep talking about it.
Absolutely. We will be on the other side.
That's right.
On the other side of Zoom is what.
On the other side of Zoom too.
Right.
Zoom apocalyptic moment. Yes.
For sure.
Gee whiz.
Okay, well, I think we got what we needed to get. Thank y'all so much. I'm going to stop the recording.